And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 34 of the Wake Up podcast. And on this episode, I have a very, very special guest and someone very different to the kind of guest I've interviewed in the past, but a guest who covers a topic that I'm personally quite interested in, and I think a lot of my listeners are interested in. So Jean-François Gariépy, I'm gonna fuck that up. Who's the YouTuber, biologist, and author of a brilliant book called The Revolutionary Phenotype. Thank you for joining the show, my friend. I will throw it over to you to add any context to you, your book, your background, which I'm sure the audience would love to know more about.
Absolutely. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm a scientist. I've done a doctorate in neuroscience, and then I've done research on monkeys in the US. And eventually I got tired of working in universities, and in search for some liberty of thought, I started developing my own theories in a book, The Revolutionary Phenotype, because I knew that in academia, in the university, when you're employed there, you don't have time really to do the deep thinking that a true novel theory requires. You can do some little work here and there, but there's so much pressure to publish that you end up publishing crap. And so what got me out of the university was this desire to pursue higher quality science. And I'm very satisfied with the theory that I came with, which is a theory about the emergence of life and ultimately why we are the way we are. We didn't know why we had layers of genetic code. We knew we had them for many decades now, but we didn't know why. And my book explains why. Why do we have DNA? Why do we have RNA? People are hearing about these molecules these days because they're starting to make vaccines with them, but they are fundamental molecules of our biology. And it was always an unresolved question. Another unresolved question that my book solves is, why do we have sex? How did it emerge the first time? What was the first act of sex? Because it's easy to understand why pairs of males and females would reproduce and make babies, but how do you get the first male and the first female? This was an unresolved question of biology. So that's what I seek to address with my book, The Revolutionary Phenotype.
I think the job you did with putting together a theory, like me personally, I've always been drawn to ideas and concepts that fit nicely when you can sort of logically deduce from first principles things that make sense. And this is, I would say, why I'm also a libertarian, because it's one of the only, I guess, in the traditional sense of a libertarian, these days there's so many flavors, but in the traditional sense of libertarian with non-aggression, the silver rule, and just sort of this idea of natural rights, it's one of the only consistent forms of human governance that I can see that functions. And for me, listening to this, I guess because I've always had these sorts of questions, and we're going to dig into some of the larger questions around God and divinity and Darwinism, natural selection, everything towards the end of the podcast. But I just feel like this book, at least for me, really delivered on that promise of a theory that doesn't need special events and stuff like that to really have it make sense. Like it makes sense from first principles, and I want to commend you on putting together a brilliant piece of work, and for everyone listening to absolutely get the damn book, because it's really, really good.
But I'm glad you were sensitive to this, because it's an aspect of modern science that is so disappointing. People don't do that anymore. Think of the mathematics at the base of it all. Think of what's the structure here and what leads to our observation. Instead, the modern scientists, they're kind of cataloging empirical facts. Oh, here's this fact here. Here's this fact here. And and this is disappointing, because when we look at the history of science, most of the scientific discoveries, the big ones, came from visionaries who saw something before we even could record it. And so that's what I tried bringing back to the best of my ability.
man, I would love to echo that point, because that we're sort of living in an age where the tail wags the dog instead of the tail wagging the dog. Sorry, instead of the dog wagging the tail. It's we're asked backwards now. Is where we're randomly, blindly finding things, like you said, through this sort of insane drive for empiricism, at the expense of something cohesive, or consistent, that actually makes sense. And I guess, we don't have to, say this, but the world that we're living in today is a perfect example of complete abandon, when it comes to just empirical bullshit based on different studies in different parts of the world about different things, whether it's masks and vaccines and lockdowns. Like, nothing makes sense. There's nothing consistent. There's nothing cohesive. Shit that's not science gets called science. It's just madness. And I actually think it's a lot to do with the fact that we've abandoned cohesive thinking, we've abandoned conceptual thinking, we've abandoned first principles, and we are in this blind need for random empirical facts that we don't care how it fits. I observed that. So
yeah, I
that
think
must
we're in
be
a world in decomposition and a combat against any principle. And you see that on the left in this fight against patriarchy or whatever they call it. They don't like structure. And you see that in atheism and the fight against religion. There's a hate for everything that comes from the top and applies on us. But if you don't see the world that way, if you don't understand that we are this little thing in the world, and that our own existence that as individuals is fragile, but even the entire planet and even our status as human civilization is fragile. If you don't understand that we stand on the shoulder of giants and huge principles that we can't quite escape, I think you miss some of the big fascination of science, an occasion to look at this big world and see, wow, I'm just that little point in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to the point of our hierarchies, and I'll try not to digress too much here, but I think part of the I guess the disdain for hierarchies is the fact that we do have, like, the way I try and differentiate them is this idea of natural hierarchies that are emergent versus fiat hierarchies that are just randomly decreed. And I use the fiat word, quite broadly these days, because fiat to me is basically anything that is blindly decreed, that just it is because somebody said so, versus something that actually emerges through time, through experience, through trial and error, through and that forms over time. And that's sort of a podcast that I did the other week with Zuby and a guy called Stephen Cole. We sort of discuss how principles, they're almost timeless. That they're things that have existed over time, and they weren't decreed or dictated by someone. That there were things that everybody in different places around the world sort of emerged and converged on, in a sense. And that's a very different kind of hierarchy than what people, I think, subconsciously hate. But the problem is we've just got this confusion where, because there's some fiat hierarchies, we throw the baby out with the bathwater, and people are assuming that all hierarchies are bad, so we should just deconstruct everything, and everything is meaningless, and it's all relative. There's no such thing as morals, blah, blah, blah. It's just sort of all the good disappears by trying to, frame it all as bad, which is stupid.
That's actually the subject of the book I'm writing right now, The Moral Signal, which is not out yet. I'm looking at hierarchy, moral signaling, and why ultimately there's this bullshit or fiat hierarchy, as you call it. And ultimately it's that it's inevitable. If there's a good hierarchy, if there's a good system of communication and tradition, let's say, in humanity, this system can be exploited by outside agents for other purposes. The same way adult videos, for example, have recruited our attention for sex in a way that is not advantageous to us. But this happens in the domain of employment, in the economy, in the political sector, and you have all these grifting forces ready to just parasitize anything that actually works. I think we live in a highly parasitic moment of human civilization.
We do, but then again, on a, you know, I guess on a macro scale, you know, there's the corrective nature of existence, which is as the parasite grows too much, it starts to decay, and then, you know, the system corrects. So long as we get the fuck out of the way and allow it to correct. I should I didn't know you were writing this, but if you like, I actually wrote an entire so I'm writing a I'm doing it as a series of essays, but I think I might actually publish it as a book. But the first one is called Territory, Hierarchy, and something else. Anyway, it takes basically an anthropological viewpoint of how hierarchies emerge, you know, hierarchies of competence, and how it actually involves Bitcoin as, you know, as a thing that exists that actually cannot be manipulated. So it sort of re-incentivizes human beings towards hierarchies of competence and allows hierarchies that build to correct sooner, as opposed to becoming these parasitic edifices that end up collapsing under their own weight. So anyway, I might share that with you after this, because I think
fascinating.
It might be. So, all right. We have digressed. So I want to get into I want to get into your book. So let's start first and foremost, I guess, with the basic premise of the book. It's called The Revolutionary Phenotype. So can we define two things? Can we define phenotype versus replicator, and the idea of a general versus revolutionary phenotype? If we can begin there.
Yeah. So a phenotype is just as opposed to a genotype. It's a term that was used by scientists at first simply to point to the fact that when we look at a population, let's say of mice, they have different genes, and they also have different bodies and different features. Sometimes it may be the hair color, sometimes it may be just a little difference in the shape of the fingers or whatever. There are differences within population, and we wanted a term that distinguishes between, are these differences genetic, in which case we say it's the genotype, or are they differences that could have their source in genes, but that ultimately we observe in the body, and we decided to call essentially the entire body a phenotype. Phenotype meaning, okay, the type of mice you have, the type of pea plant you have, whatever. And phenotype was essentially just this kind of population analysis statistical term until thinkers in biology from Charles Darwin really to Richard Dawkins, and including along the way John Maynard Smith, Robert Trivers, they realized that the distinction between the genotype and the phenotype is super important. It's critical to how biology works. It's critical to how evolution works. Because one thing we found is that essentially the only thing that transfers between a parent and a offspring is DNA in a perfect copy. There are other things that transfer, some cellular materials, some proteins. Milk, for example, transfers between mother and children. But those transfers are really occurring without copy. So DNA's transfer from parents to offspring is special because DNA makes a copy of itself. And that's where we decided to call, well, that's where Richard Dawkins came up with the word replicator. He said, there's something special about DNA. DNA replicates. Unlike all of these other things which can transform, transfer? They can transfer themselves from generation to generation. DNA is the only one that actually gets printed, and therefore let's call it a replicator. So it became a term that is classical in biology to say, okay, there's the replicators, it's your DNA. And then there's all the rest of your life. That's the phenotype. And this concept of a phenotype got even extended by Richard Dawkins with his book, The Extended Phenotype, where he said, you know, your phenotype includes not only your body and everything that's inside of you, it also includes the effect of your body in the rest of the world. So he pointed out, if you play some music and someone else hears the music, your phenotype is kind of extending into their ears and extending into their brains. And suppose that you change their behavior by playing music, we could say that your phenotype is manipulating the brain of the other person in a way. So that's where the word phenotype comes from. So before my book, it was generally thought as essentially the rest of the universe, except the genes, except the DNA, which are replicators. And the reason it was important is that Richard Dawkins came with the concept, and it was not necessarily just his idea. It came from John von Neumann before, and John Maynard Smith, and Robert Rivers. He came with the concept of the selfish gene. And the selfish gene is this realization that because DNA is the only thing that replicates, and we can get into the details of, okay, maybe human culture replicates, but let's get to that later. But DNA seems to be the only obviously transmitted molecule that makes a copy of itself across generations. And so the selfish gene expresses the simple mathematical idea that as these replicators make more copies of themselves, some of them will just be better at surviving, as it turns out. You may have DNA, for example, that gives you blonde hair and blue eye, and you become super popular on the sexual market. Or maybe it gives you big muscles and it allows you to survive in the forest. Whatever is the characteristic that DNA gives you that makes you survive better and reproduce better, there will be more of that DNA in the future, and there will be less of the other DNA, the dysfunctional one. So that's the process called natural selection. And Richard Dawkins realized, wow, it's as if the genes are doing everything for themselves. It's as if they want to survive, because the more they build bodies that help them surviving, the more selfish they become, the more they want even more. And so that's the process that is called natural selection, which we believe is responsible for the whole diversity of life forms that we see today. So the reason life forms are so beautifully adapted to their environment is this selfish gene principle. So do you have question there, or do I move to then what's a revolutionary phenotype?
Okay, so not so much a question, but maybe just a summation of what you said. So the replicator sort of comes in a single form, which is DNA. And the hypothesis here is, or at least, again, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, is, whether it's a hypothesis or whether it's proven, but there's been other replicators before, but the dominant replicator at the moment is DNA, and everything other than DNA is a tool of DNA, and the tool is what we are defining for all intents and purposes here as the phenotype.
Exactly. So if you adopt the selfish gene perspective of Dawkins, everything that DNA will do will always improve to save more and reproduce more of itself. That's why he said that genes were selfish. And so everything becomes a tool across generations, because suppose you have two DNA strands, one makes you have some wings that allow you to fly, and one makes kind of the same wings, but they're not as good, and you don't fly as high and you don't fly as fast. Well, the DNA that makes you have wings that fly the best will outcompete all the others. So everything in the world becomes a tool for DNA. That's why we say DNA is selfish.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so then let's extend that then to this idea of revolutionary phenotypes and how they differ from general.
Yeah. So before my book, there was no trace of ever a case in biology where the selfish gene theory wouldn't be true. Literally, the last 4 billion years of evolution, the entire tree of ancestry of everything that's alive today, the ensemble of everything we've ever seen in life was all explainable by the selfish gene. And when I undertook to write this book, I was pretty much convinced that biology was completed, and that essentially my attempt to find a contradiction, to find that Dawkins was wrong at least once, I was convinced that I was embarked on a mission that would fail. So, as a young reader of Dawkins and the Selfish Gene, you know, I've read this maybe around 12 years old. And it's been a fundamental pillar of my life. There was no way I could ever question the selfish gene. I thought it was explaining so beautifully everything. But I'm stubborn, and I decided, what if I was to do the extreme thought experiment of trying to violate the selfish gene? How does something come to fight against a gene and win? And this question, which started as a purely theoretical question, ended up revealing some powerful facts about how replicators emerge in the first place, of what happened 4 billion years ago for the first DNA strand to emerge. So a revolutionary phenotype is a piece of your body that decides that it won't be a tool of the genes anymore. It decides to become a gene itself, and in fact, it succeeds at doing so. It takes over generations, it takes over the organism, kicks out the old genes, and decides to replace it with its own, and reuse, in fact, the old genes to just go on with its own existence, as if you will. An example of a phenotypic revolution that could happen but never happened is if a cancer cell in your body starts developing a tumor. But suppose the cancer tumor was to become so intelligent that it would actually trick you, manipulate you into finding ways to make babies of itself, and you would be seeding tumor maybe in other human beings or maybe in your own children. And somehow, eventually, after perhaps tens of thousands of years, would eventually stop your line of descent, and the tumor, the cancerous tumor, would find a way to live on its own. That's what a phenotypic revolution is. And what I found out, at my total surprise, is that it happened. It's the best explanation for what happened 4 billion years ago. In fact, my book makes the case we have to accept that 3 phenotypic revolutions have been happening here on planet Earth, that it happened all in a very tight window of about 500 million years at the beginning of the life of planet Earth, about 4 billion years ago, and that it explains who we are now and why we are the way we are. And in fact, another warning of my book is it's about to happen again, because we are creating the conditions, but we'll get there. It's another thing, but we are currently creating the condition for it to happen again. And the consequences are devastating for humans.
Would just as you were describing the cancer analogy, would another analogy be like those zombie films where, you know, the almost the zombie virus that infects the agent, and they turn into a zombie and then spread the zombie virus? Like, would that be an example potentially? Like, would that be a way someone could understand how revolutionary phenotype would work? Or
it's a little bit how it works. However, it doesn't qualify. A zombie virus that would take over your brain and make you act in ways, that is just parasitism. The revolutionary phenotype is a separate class of event, because on top of being a parasite, the revolutionary phenotype really finds a way to transmit itself across your generations and eventually to kick you out of its line of descent. So it's a little more vicious than parasitism. The revolutionary phenotype succeeds at becoming a total novel life form, whereas A virus that would take over your brain is an already existing life form that's really just using your body for its own purpose, which often happens. And it happens in insects, where we see zombie insects being taken over by parasites. But the revolutionary phenotype is a different class of event, among other reasons, because it will eventually destroy the genes of all your descendants, but also because it repurposes the genetic line. Whereas the parasite that would come into your brain, transform you into a zombie, it's not really making use of your DNA. It's making use of what DNA deployed in your brain and your physiological mechanism. And it's generally, if such a thing happens, it will be a one-generation interaction. It won't keep harassing you across generations. It won't necessarily parasite your babies. The revolutionary phenotype parasites your babies until there's none left.
Okay, interesting. So the again, with the scenario of the zombies, that would hold true unless the zombies somehow manage to reproduce and create other zombies until such time that the DNA that was human in the first place didn't exist and it was another life form. Correct?
Well,
like, are we?
That, yeah, in a way it's correct, but my book does the thinking around this. Essentially, that's what I've been imagining in my head. So how would a virus zombie like this take over DNA? And the problem is that DNA has its own mechanism of defense, which I frame as 4 different problems, but really they are 4 mechanisms of defense that DNA will not let this happen. See, if there were a population of zombie viruses that take over people's brain, people would evolve away from these zombies. They would evolve defense mechanism. They would evolve immune reactions, so it wouldn't penetrate their brain anymore. They would evolve perhaps staying away from certain areas where these viruses are common. So you find yourself, I've done the thinking that Richard Dawkins had been doing in the 80s, and concluding that, my God, there's no way to get the zombie virus to win. The only way is if the zombie virus was to start modifying our DNA. Because once the zombie virus would modify our DNA, we couldn't evolve anymore. And slowly the zombie virus could transform us into essentially the victim of a phenotypic revolution, into a lesser version of ourselves that couldn't possibly fight against the virus. But that's where the analogy that you propose has its limits. It's because no virus has ever done this. It's the other way around. In fact, the things that lead to phenotypic revolutions are things that are created within the body rather than outside of it. They don't come from other planets, or they don't come to parasite our brain. They are pieces of ourselves that eventually hijack the whole system.
Okay, that's a brilliant segue. So and also a brilliant distinction between the scenarios. So I want to talk about things like abiogenesis and proteins and quantum, but I'm going to save that for later. Can we quickly, before we get into the 4 problems for a revolutionary phenotype to occur, and then what the solution is, the replicator tango and things like that, can we quickly define, I think, genes, memes, queens, and creams? Have I got those correct?
Yes. So, I mean, those terms came before me. First, genes. Well, genes is DNA in our case. And it is the term that has been classically emerging before we even knew that we had DNA. So it comes from a biologist whose name was Johansson. And he said, he looked at plants, and he saw that the plants, when they were producing offspring, the offspring would have the same characteristics as the parent. So a pea plant that has configuration of PA would lead to babies that had the same configuration of peas. And if there was another configuration of pea, this would produce offspring of the other configuration. So he said, there must be something that passes from the parent to the offspring. And he said, let's call them genes. And genes have, so we knew that something had to be passed and replicated, but we eventually discovered it was DNA. And Richard Dawkins kind of generalized this idea and said, you know, instead of being confused and calling them gene, when in fact, when the word gene came out, we didn't know what it would be. Let's call them replicators, because it's really their distinguishing feature. It's that they make a copy, because a lot of things transfer from parent to offspring, as we've made the case before, like milk, but it doesn't replicate. There's no copying
What do you mean by,
process.
sorry, what do you mean by milk transfers? What do you mean? Just like breastfeeding, like, or?
Yeah, breastfeeding. I mean, in a way, you could argue, for example, that the molecules of fat in the milk, some of them may come from your environment, but some of them comes from your mother. And so if you have breastfed when you were young, there are fat molecules inside of you that come from your mother. And there were molecules inside of her that came from her mother. And so this is to distinguish, because a lot of thinkers are confused around this. Inheritance versus replication. I inherited the milk of my mother, but it's not inheritance in a way that matters to the theory of biology. What really matters for natural selection is replication. And there was no process of replication when my mother was breastfeeding me. I was really, she was just, it's as if our DNA was carrying these fat molecules in our breast, and I'm now carrying them in my body. But there is no replication. Nothing has looked at milk from the past generation and say, oh, I'm going to produce a copy of this milk. It didn't happen. So a very important distinction that, in fact, some of the best thinkers in the field totally forgo and are not conscious about, is the difference between inheritance and replication. The genes, they replicate. The milk, it just passes.
Interesting. Is that and that goes for do you have any other examples other than the milk, just to really bring this one home? So milk is something, you know, we get. What other things would we inherit?
To some extent, I mean, I want to leave it later because it's a more complex subject, but culture to some extent passes between generation, but does not affect an actual copy. But it gets more complicated if we go that route. But yeah, any transfer of nutrients happening from parent to offspring, any parental care, in fact, is a delivery of something to the next generation. So birds protecting their youth, bringing worms into their mouth. All of this are transfers that are happening across generations. So in a way, you can argue it's inheritance. There is something being inherited here, but it's not replication. The only thing that we know that does an actual replication is DNA. So by replication, we mean there's a little molecule that comes that reads DNA and that says, I'm going to write another DNA molecule that's exactly the same as this one or close to this one.
Okay. All right. So that's genes.
And this brings us to the definition of cream, because it's this whole thinking around milk that led me to say, all right, well, we have the word gene, so genes replicate, and then we have milk, and milk doesn't replicate. So let's call this cream. So you have genes and you have cream. Cream doesn't make copies of itself, genes do. And so then we get into the more complex subject of what are memes. Well, the thing is, when Richard Dawkins came with his framework of replication theory and the selfish gene, people were so excited, and Richard Dawkins himself was so excited that he thought, you know what, maybe there's more than DNA. Maybe there's other things that make copies of themselves. And he came to the idea that human culture may be making copies of itself. So if I have 2 + 2 = 4 in my head, and my parents had 2 + 2 = 4 in their head, some copying process must have happened. How else would the same representation of symbols be present in our two brains? And so it led to the idea that, okay, human IDs are replicators also, and instead of calling them genes, let's call them memes. It's an idea that is flawed, and I show in my book why, and we can get there in time. But it's an idea that is flawed, and it's like almost true. That's the sad thing. Yes, human culture makes copies of itself across brain, and yet it still isn't a Darwinian replicator because of the way these copies are made. But yeah, so, and eventually other thinkers like Susan Blackmore said, well, there's more than gene and memes. There's tremes. And tremes, she thought, was, you know, these computers, they make copies of themselves. In a hard drive, there are lots of bits that resemble each other, and there are copying of files occurring. So there's replicator in technology, and she was kind of scared that the technological replicators would take over or something. And so she said, you know, let's treat technology as a replicator, and let's call them TREAM or team. And I said, you know what? Let's forget about adding new freaking letters at each time we discover something that makes a copy of itself. I'm going to call everything that makes a copy of itself a queen. Queene. And so that way, you know, genes are queens, memes are queens, streams are queens. Essentially, a queen is something that makes a copy of itself, and cream is something that doesn't make copies of itself.
And was that a queen with a M like memes, or queen with an N like genes?
Queen with an N like jeans. Queen. Okay. Yeah, it's like jeans, but the G is changed with QU. It's
to Q. Okay.
It used to be the way queen was written in ancient English, but since the word was abandoned, and in modern English, queen now has two E's, I took it back.
Okay, so queens are any form of replicator, whilst creams are everything else in that case. So we've got two broad categories. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. There's a few places I want to go here, but I still think we need to define the problems before we sort of dig into these, because I think part of your hypothesis is that not all queens are equal, right? It's
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So let's then. Do you think now's the right time to talk about the problems?
Yeah. The problems would be perfect here. So
okay.
The problems are thought experiments that I've made in my head that lasted about 4 or 5 years. And I mean, I've been seriously thinking about it. And it took me like 6 months to find the two problems, because those were problems that other thinkers had already been touching upon. And it took me like 3 or 4 years just finding the third one, the one that Richard Dawkins was missing. So the way I approach this is, okay, suppose I'm the phenotype and I want to be a revolutionary phenotype. Suppose I want to kick DNA out. What would I need to do? If I'm a piece of the body, and of course you're faced with so many problems. The problem is you can't quite kill your host. If you're a cancerous tumor, for example, if you kill your host, you're gonna die with it. So that's one of that's actually all of the problems relate to this, in the sense that you can never quite go too aggressive when you're a parasitic life form or when you're a revolutionary phenotype. And so those problems are problems that need to be solved if anything wants to become a life form. And there's 4 of them.
Let's do them.
All right, so let's start. Well, we have the first problem is forgetfulness. So let's say a piece of skin. Let's say I get an injury. This injury will not show up in my descendants. And so the maximum time that this injury, this scratch on my skin will last is maybe 70 years, 80 years. But once I die, there will be no more injury. And my kids, in fact, will have perfect skin without the injuries that I've had. They may get their own injuries, but there will not have been a copying process made of my injuries. So that's the first problem. The problem of forgetfulness. And so most of our body forgets. Most of our body does not make copies of itself. And there are some cells that do make copies of themselves in our body. In fact, the reason we grow, the reason we start from a single cell in the belly of our mother and we grow into a full human being is a copying process. But this copying process is what Richard Dawkins had called a dead-end process. Once I die, all of these copies of all of my cells will all disappear. They have no way to reproduce. And we've never seen a case of a piece of human body that gets detached from us and that lives on its own. You know, it's because these cells are all programmed really to care for my reproduction, but not for their own. In a way, our entire phenotype, our body, is submissive to the interest of our reproduction. And because our life form has been evolving to reproduce solely by sperm and egg meeting each other, our body doesn't care about other forms of reproduction that could in principle be possible, but that have been so that have been never used in our evolutionary history. So we didn't evolve to kind of spread our end cells on the counter and form little versions of ourselves growing everywhere in the world. The way we evolved for is sperm meets the egg, and therefore that's what everything our body does, everything our body cares about is oriented on this. Whether it's sexual attraction as it is conceived of by our brain, or even, you know, the fact that we can walk, the fact that we can talk, the fact that we have hearts and lungs that keep us alive. All of this exists for the non-forgetful part of our body, which is our gametes, sperm and egg. So that is the first problem that a life form finds if it wants to become, that a phenotypic part finds if it wants to become a life form, because our genes are already a life form, really.
Yeah, okay, cool. So that was the distinction. I think you just said it is. So we're talking about a phenotype here who is fundamentally forgetful, but so in the process of serving the non-forgetful element of us, it makes copies, but only for that purpose, not for the purpose of replicating itself.
Exactly. So one way to phrase it is that the only way for a phenotype to save itself is to save the genes. And that's why Richard Dawkins said that genes were selfish. It's like,
yeah, okay.
Our legs, our arms, the only way there can be legs and arms in the next generation is not really through a copying of the legs or the arm, because there's no mechanism by which we could 3D print ourselves into the future that way. The only mechanism through which they can do that is by helping DNA, which creates an asymmetry, right? Because imagine you're playing a game of whatever, any sport. And imagine that they set a rule in that sport where you can try to win the game, but every time you score a point, every time you score a point in the adversary's goal, you need to also come back to your goal and score a point for the other team. Is there a way you can win that match? No, you can't. Because every time you gain a point, you have to give a point to the adversary also. So you can only lose. And this is the realization of Richard Dawkins, that the phenotype can only lose. He even conceived of conflicts that could happen or things that could go wrong in this system. He called these power struggles. And he said, these power struggles will eventually resolve to the victory of the genes always. And he was almost right. And the revolutionary phenotype being an exception.
Okay. So forgetfulness. Then the second problem, the naked warrior problem. So tell us about
All right. So the naked wire problem. Suppose we've solved the problem of forgetfulness. So suppose there's a piece of my skin that is able to make copies of itself. I cut a part of my skin, I leave it on the counter, and it keeps making copies of itself. Suppose that by accident it found a solution. The piece of skin is faced with another problem, the naked wire problem, which is, imagine if you have been trained in martial arts or combat or military stuff. You have a sword, a shield, and you're very talented. You can slash through your opponent. But imagine I remove everything from you. Imagine I remove the shield, the armor. You're now naked in front of an army. And no matter what you do, even if you still have your training, you'll be unable to win any fight because you don't have your equipment. That's the naked wire problem. And it's what life forms in beginning, if you will, life forms that are starting off, they face this problem. So if I was to have a piece of my skin that makes copies of itself, I drop it on the counter. Suddenly the piece of skin doesn't have blood anymore. It doesn't have access to lungs that are replenishing the oxygen reserves. It doesn't have nutrients. It doesn't have an immune system. And so sooner or later, even if it was to make a couple of copies of itself, sooner or later it would be faced by an environment that is way too harsh. The naked wire problem emerges from the fact that all of our body evolves to assume the rest of the body is there. And it doesn't quite, it never evolves to assume that it won't be there. Or in very restricted situation does it do so. There are cases, for example, of salamanders that can lose a part of their tail and regrow it. You could argue that essentially the part of salamander that survives this process as kind of, it can be naked from a part of its body, but it's very rare that you can lose a big part of the body and still survive. So the naked wire problem is just this. It's the fact that even when phenotypic machines, parts of our phenotype are finding ways to copy themselves, they can't quite start their own life form because they're isolated and alone. Another example of a very real expression of the naked wire problem is in sterile worker ants. So if you have an ant colony and the queen is producing sterile workers, they work hard, they bring back nutrients to the colony. Eventually, if the queen dies, the sterile workers in those species that are unable to create a new queen, because there are some species that are able to create a new queen, but in those species that are unable to do so, the sterile worker is meaningless. They might continue bringing back nutrients to the colony, but it serves nothing anymore because the queen being already died, there is no way for the sterile worker to pass its genes into the next generation. So eventually, no matter what happens, entropy will make it so that there's too much cost and there will be no production of further sterile workers, and eventually the sterile workers will all die. So a sterile worker that's isolated from its queen or that its queen has already died is a naked warrior in the sense that it doesn't have all of the equipment needed to go on with life.
What about, okay, so that's a macro representation of the micro process. While you were talking about the salamander example, I was thinking about worms. Can't you chop a worm in half and like both sides are alive or something like that?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I've heard this, and I think it's not impossible. I've never seen it myself, but it could happen. And if that was to happen, it definitely happens in plants. So in plants, you can cut off a branch, and both the branch and the old tree can survive. Now, how do we handle those cases? Because Richard Dawkins was already confronted with this problem, because he had come up with the concept of a dead-end replicator, like these pieces of our body that can't quite evolve, but that do make copies of themselves. And he said, let's just accept that the tree has two ways to make babies. The tree can make babies by its flowers and normal reproduction, and then there's a seed, and the seed leads to another tree. And the tree can also make cloned copies of itself, parthenogenesis of some kind, by separating a piece of its body and letting it grow into a totally new tree. So that's the way we approach it, which is, given that the new branch of the tree that I've cut and that I've planted in the soil, given that it will have the exact copies of the genes of the tree that I took it from, there's no real reason to classify this as a separate biological event. It's just trees have two ways to make babies, and maybe these worms that you can cut in half, maybe they have two ways to make babies also. But since it doesn't change the genes, and as far as the genes are concerned, a copy has been created. And since we also know that there are frogs, for example, that can make copies of themselves without sexual reproduction, we call this parthenogenesis, when a female can decide, all right, I find no male of quality here, I'm gonna fertilize my own egg.
This sounds like where we're going with humanity.
Unfortunately, with dire consequences, but yes, we are headed there. But yeah, so it exists, and we call it parthenogenesis, or if you will, alternative baby making path, but it doesn't fundamentally change the gene, so we don't call these revolutionary phenotypes or separate phenotypes.
Okay, would you say that those categories are in and of themselves solutions to the naked warrior problem, or do you think they just don't qualify under that umbrella at all?
Are they solutions to the naked warrior problem? No, they are not. I mean, they are from the perspective of the baby, the little piece of branch being taken off. In a way, they are. But they are not in a way that's interesting to phenotypic revolution. So they are kind of another spot of the multidimensional space of possibilities. And in fact, at the end of the book, I do indicate that these three problems, there are alternative solutions and there are other ways life can take. But I really only explored them in the context of phenotypic revolution because this was my subject.
Okay. So, all right. So then let's go into the third problem, which is, I guess, I tried to sum it up as the trickster printer and full replicator problem. If I summed it up correctly there?
Yes. So we have our first two problems. The phenotype is forgetful, and the phenotype has difficulty surviving when it's isolated. Richard Dawkins was there. He knew about these two problems. He used his own words to describe them, but he knew about them. And there I was, thinking either there's a third problem and Richard Dawkins missed something, or there are many things that are replicators and that are competing with DNA. And Richard Dawkins took the path of saying, all right, those are the two only problems, and therefore human culture is memes, human culture is a replicator, it makes copies across human brains. I took a different path. I say, no, memes cannot have attained the status of replicator. There's something wrong with memes, and I have to find it, and it will lead us to the third problem of the phenotype. And this is what I spent years on without making progress at times, but eventually found it. So the problem comes when you consider what prints the replicator. When you consider that in the process of a replicator making a copy of itself, there can be agents that come and play with the copying process. And I call these trickster printers. So when we look at our DNA, we find no trickster printer. When we look at DNA, when a parent copies its DNA and puts it into the offspring, we see a molecule that comes, that reads and writes. And this is what I would call a reliable printer or a Darwinian printer. a Darwinian printer has certain characteristics, and they come from the theory of evolution. It's at first we add these characteristics as axioms, and we eventually discovered that it was the case. That's how DNA works. So they make copies that are highly with high fidelity, and when they make errors, these errors are random. And by random here, what we mean is they are not actively being manipulated. So random is a so-so concept in the universe, because I don't believe in ultimate random. And ultimately, when you look at what causes mutations in DNA, you'll find that it's a light ray from the sun that came and zapped the process. And because we know that exposure to, for example, UV radiation will increase the chances of mutation. So definitely it's never quite random, but it's random enough. That's my point. What I call a Darwinian printer is a printer that's random enough, and where these events that come from either magnetic radiation from the sun or nuclear radiation from the earth or whatever it is that cause it is random enough that this process doesn't care about us. And so let's define printer first. A printer is whatever reads and writes, and in the process of writing can make some errors. So how many errors does the DNA printer do? Well, it does just so little errors that out of 6 billion DNA letters that you have in your genome, it will make 64 errors. 64 errors out of 6 billion. And these 64 errors would be random enough. They would be by entities that don't really care about us and that are not trying to manipulate us into becoming something. That's what I mean by random. Now, I imagined a different type of printer. What if the printer cared about us? What if the printer wanted us to become something? For example, imagine squirrels. We didn't really care about what squirrels would become. We see them in our park. They've evolved for themselves. They became nut eaters, and they don't annoy humans too much, and they just do their thing. But what if we really, really liked pink squirrels? What if we liked pink squirrels so much that we were to go in the park every 10 years, take every squirrel we can find and start introducing genes in them that makes them pink or fluo bright colors. And then we send them back in the park. And then 10 years later, we do it again until all of the populations of squirrel are absolute flashy pink. The question is, if we were to engage in that kind of activity, would the squirrel, could they be said to be subject to Darwinian evolution? And my point in chapter 9 is to say no. Once you play with nature like this, once you start introducing whatever you want in the genome, you are a trickster printer. You are not a Darwinian printer. You are playing with nature, and what is happening there cannot be characterized as natural selection. In fact, it cannot be characterized as selection at all. You're really sculpting something. You're making a Frankensteinist monster out of what you see in the world and what you want the world to be. And so I created this distinction, which is the missing part of biology, in my view, between reliable and random printer, Darwinian printers, which happens to our DNA, and trickster printers, which is when life forms start playing with their genes.
So basically, maybe the word, I don't know if the word intent is the right thing here, but like a trickster printer has an intention, whereas the Darwinian printer doesn't have an intention. Any errors are shit happens, basically.
Yeah, it's a way to see it. However, my book is not about intention, so I made my book about evolutionary forces. So the way I define a trickster printer is if there are evolutionary forces pushing a life form to go one way or another. Now, these evolutionary forces can involve an intent. So, for example, let's say humans would evolve to prefer pigs that are very fat. Well, we may modify pigs to be very fat across generations. It would be in our evolutionary advantage, and it would be modifying the pigs, and so we would qualify as a trickster printer of the pigs. But yeah, ultimately what I care about is not the intent of the farmer who would do this, although he may have intent for it. Ultimately, the farmer is doing this because it's good for its genes, in my theory. So the farmer would be printing pigs, trickster printing pigs, because it makes him have more babies. And I show a little like sketchy example, a sketch example in my book, which is what happens if memes were to circulate across humanity, but some of the people would be bound to Darwinian printing of these memes, and some of them would be able to play with these memes, change them. And so I make this thought experiment. Suppose you have a meme that goes around social media that says, make moral babies. So this meme, once you see it, you're suddenly wanting to educate your children in a moral framework, and you spend so much time doing this that you make less babies. Now, suppose that a trickster printer, a person, receives this meme and says, I'm not going to spread the make moral babies meme. I'm going to start spreading the make more babies meme. And this person starts producing babies and starts sending memes to his surrounding, to his family, telling, all right, make more babies, make more babies, make more babies. And they end up making more babies. In this system, which is a trickster printing system, the trickster printer, the guy who changed the meme for something better, wins over the other. And eventually, all of humanity is filled with tricksters. Eventually, humanity is filled with people who want to change the memes according to their own interest. And this is where memes fail. This is where Richard Dawkins was wrong. Human culture is not a Darwinian replicator. Yes, it makes copies. Yes, it's irritable. Yes, it's heritable. But it's not a Darwinian replicator because it's subject to trickster printing.
So in that sense, so that's where the full replicator comes in. Is so it's not a genuine replicator, it's a full replicator, because it is the one being it is the subject, not the doer in that sense, correct?
Exactly. So I say there are Darwinian replicators or just replicators, and then there's full replicator. And a full replicator is simply a replicator that is subject to mutational change by a trickster printer.
So would the full replicator then actually be a phenotype in that sense, or not really?
That's the whole realization of my book, which is that we've started with distinction between replicators and phenotype. But what we really care about is not so much what's a phenotype or what's not a phenotype. What we care about is what is selfish in life. And Richard Dawkin said the genes are selfish. And so the memes, they are replicator in the sense that they replicate, but they are full replicator in the sense that they are not selfish. So ultimately, we care more about the selfish than the gene. We care more about the selfishness than the replicator. And as far as memes are concerned, in the way they are being manipulated across generation through trickster printing, they are like the phenotype. They are evolving according to the interest of DNA. And so what does this resolve? Because, it's very technical what we've just discussed, but I got launched on this line of thought based on very simple consideration. First, the people like Richard Dawkins, Susan Blackmore, they had predicted in the 80s and 90s that religion would be a parasite of the mind, for example, that people would adhere to religious belief against the interest of their own reproduction. And they were awfully wrong. their prediction was essentially that religion was living off like a parasite, like a meme inside our brain and draining our energy, and that religion would be such a parasitic entity. Now, that was absolutely beside the track, because what we know now from the data is that atheists make much less babies than religious people. Religion is not living as a parasite inside of us, it's living as a nutrient inside of us.
Interesting. Okay, so I don't know if we should go into the fourth problem here, if we should talk about, let's maybe talk about solutions after. So
yeah,
I think
well,
maybe
the
one
thing
thing
is, the fourth problem doesn't make sense until we talk about how we will resolve the first three. So the
okay.
best order to go is talk about the solution to these three problems.
Okay, let's do that then. So the replicator tango, talk us through.
Yeah. So I'm faced with these three problems, and I'm like, these three problems must be solved, and they must be solved all at once in a way, because there's no place for a phenotypic machine to evolve until it has solved the three of them all at once. If you solve just one of them, you're still a phenotype. You're still not a revolutionary phenotype. And in life, in evolution, you cannot solve complex problems all at once. It's very rare. But I was like, this must be an exception. There must be something that solves the three in a single shot. And I found replicator tangos, and that's based on my thinking of what had to happen 4 billion years ago. So we have DNA. So I started imagining, okay, DNA was once not a replicator. So how could it become a replicator? How could it engage in a phenotypic revolution? And I realized the way you can neutralize these three problems at the same time is if the phenotype starts controlling the genes, start determining and printing the genes in a highly precise fashion, in a one-to-one copy fashion. Because what we knew from the beginnings of life from 4 billion years ago is we have this theory called the RNA world theory. And it hadn't been fully laid out until my book, but one key aspect of this transition, the RNA world theory is this idea that before DNA, there was something else being a replicator before DNA appeared, and this thing was RNA. And RNA is the second layer of our genetic code. It is currently existing in our body, but it no more replicates, or when it does, we call it a virus. Other than the viruses, RNA in our body is not a replicator anymore. And it turns out that this molecule must have preceded DNA for various reasons, which it's not worth listing here, but it's a pretty convincing case that RNA must have been a replicator before DNA, and then eventually lost its capacity to replicate to DNA. And thinking about this transition, I realized we can't jump from straight out RNA replication to straight out DNA replication. There's a couple of things in the first principles of evolution that are violated if we were to do this. But here's how it works. If you have a life form like RNA and it makes copies of itself, one way to allow the transition to DNA is that first this initial life form will start creating DNA without DNA being a replicator yet. It will eventually use the DNA to store the genes of the RNA. So I call them the RNA queens. So imagine you add RNA queens. They were living without DNA. Eventually, one of them has an accident. It starts producing DNA. Eventually, it starts sending its information to DNA. And in fact, eventually, RNA finds that DNA is so precise, so much better than itself, then the RNA queen is better trusting DNA for producing its own babies. The RNA queen abandons the production of her own babies and starts giving our genetic information to DNA. and tasks DNA to produce more RNA molecules. So the way you can picture this, if it was to happen today, it's as if instead of doing sperm and egg reproduction, you were to sequence your genome, put it in a computer, and then tell the computer, all right, please produce a baby for me that has this genome. There might be a lot of medical gains to be had doing this, but it's what RNA did 4 billion years ago. It's what we're finding, and it's what my book demonstrates. So what's this situation where you are a life form, you initially were capable of reproducing yourself, but you started trusting an intermediary in your reproductive cycle. I had to find a word for this, and I call this a replicator tango. It's when a replicator doesn't replicate directly to a copy of itself. It instead trusts an external media. The same way if you were to go to a medical clinic and put your genes on a computer and make a baby out of it, let's say in some artificial uterus or something, or maybe implanted into your wife's uterus, you would have trusted your genes to an external entity. So your genes would have been in another form for an instant. In your case, it would be a hard drive. In the case of RNA, the hard drive was DNA. In the case of RNA, RNA had found something else that could carry its genes, and it was DNA. And this leads to a cycle. It's like RNA makes DNA, DNA makes RNA, RNA makes DNA, DNA makes RNA. And that's what I call a tango. It's a system in which the evolutionary forces start being totally different from a self-replicating system.
This is actually, this was one of the pieces that I just found so elegant in your book, actually, was that it's just such a clean, I don't know if clean is the right word, but it's such a, I think elegant is the right word, just explanation about how this thing transforms. So basically, the replicator creates a phenotype that it uses as a tool, and then as the tool gets better, it finds that the tool is actually a better tool for replicating. So then it outsources all of its replication work to the tool, and then the tool, in replicating its replicator, also has to replicate itself, and along the way realizes, well, why should I also replicate the replicator? I just replicate myself and obsoletes.
It's a classical example of delegation. You see this everywhere in life, in companies. Suppose a company is doing something at very high cost, and then they find out, well, there's a subcontractor that can do it for 10 times less, and it's higher quality, actually, when I do it with him. So you end up having a delegation. Well, a phenotypic revolution and a replicator tango is an act of delegation by a life form, which we never knew could happen. We had never pictured this in our mind. But my book is the first to say, yes, there is delegation of genetic transfer happening. It happened before, and it could happen again. So let's talk about how this replicator tango situation, how it solves the first three problems all at once. Forgetfulness. So RNA makes DNA, DNA makes RNA, RNA makes DNA, DNA makes RNA. DNA has solved the problem of forgetfulness. It is now injecting its own genes into the life form of the future. The offspring will inevitably have the genes of DNA as much as it has the gene of RNA. It's embroiled in a tango, so it has the information from the two. So DNA at that moment, 4 billion years ago, became not forgetful anymore. The problem of the naked wire. By engaging in the replicator tango, DNA is not only ensuring that it's replicating, it's also ensuring that there will be future bodies made up of all of the things that RNA had evolved for, made up of all of the things that were discovered by the old replicator, full bodies to live in, or whatever these bodies were. They were probably just single cell or even smaller. But whatever it was, this simple organism DNA had secured a way to have some place to live. It was not a naked wire because on top of copying itself, it was carrying the old genes in this cycle of the replicator tango. And the trickster printer problem, this replicator tango situation doesn't solve the trickster printer problem, but it equilibrates it. So imagine the trickster printer relationship happening between human genes, DNA, and human culture. We keep modifying culture. We deceive each other. When we get some information from CNN, we don't just spout it. I mean, some people just spout it, but most people would apply some sort of analysis and say, "Oh, what am I trying? What am I being convinced of here? What is the process here?" People have taboos that will keep them from talking about certain things. People lie. People change details of a story. And sometimes people will simply reject the entirety of a story and will not transmit it. So we can say that memes, human culture, had been subject to trickster printing. Now, is DNA subject to trickster printing? Well, in the replicator tango, RNA makes DNA. So it is subject to trickster printing in a way, but then DNA makes RNA. So RNA is also subject to trickster printing. So it's the symmetry that is introduced by the replicator tango that solves the third problem. It's that, yes, DNA is victim of a trickster printer, but it's also victimizing its trickster printer by trickster printering it.
Okay,
it's repeating the problem, doubling down on it, and therefore solving it.
So instead of, but could one not argue that instead of winning, that should cause a stalemate instead? Like,
exactly. But as it turns out, all I needed was a stalemate, because once the stalemate is established, it becomes extremely easy to solve the fourth problem. But that's the reason why there's a fourth problem, is that the replicator tango only brings you to a stalemate, a place where, okay, there's no injustice anymore for the new molecule, for the phenotype. There's no more phenotype. The DNA is as much a gene at this point as RNA is, but they are at equal standing. And that's all that life needed. It was this little tunnel of possibility. It's all that it needed to create a phenotypic revolution. The fact that two things were at least equal for a moment.
Okay, so I guess then this is the perfect point to bring in problem number 4. So then how do we then revolutionize?
So problem number 4 is, okay, so we know that in modern life forms, DNA makes copies of itself and it has totally abandoned RNA. So definitely replicator tangos cannot be the end of it. So why? Why does, from a replicator tango, why does the phenotype DNA, which we can now call a revolutionary phenotype because it's about to win, and in our case, we can see that it won. Why do they win? And the answer is quite simple. They win because they're a better molecule. Suppose you have 10 organisms. Some of them are, let's say 9 of them are using this replicator tango structure. One of them has an accident. Instead of using replicator tangos, it will dedicate more and more of the responsibility of replication to DNA. It will say, you know, not only will DNA create RNA and RNA create DNA, but I'm going to spend more time, in fact, copying DNA. I'm going to start making copies straight from DNA. The thinking behind this is that in the first place, RNA started trusting DNA, so there must be a reason for it. And we know that the reason is probably that DNA mutates less, DNA is more stable, DNA breaks less, DNA loses its information less. So those are all advantages that justified in the first place why RNA would trust DNA with its babies. The same thinking applies when it comes to completely abandoning RNA. Some of the life forms, let's say you have nine of them are trusting 50% time into DNA, 50% time into RNA. Let's say that this life form finds a way to only copy DNA and spend 0 time in the form of RNA. This one life form will outcompete all the others because it mutates less, it preserves its information better, and it can therefore evolve quicker and retain the progress of its evolution. So ultimately, the fourth problem is, how do we get to self-replication of this new double-sided system? And the answer is simply one of the molecules is better than the other, and at equal footing, it will win.
Okay, so that's a pretty simple solution then for that problem.
Yeah.
So okay, I think I've got a note here, which the principle of mutational servitude. Is that to do with this replacement problem, or is that a little bit earlier?
It came in chapter 9, and this is related to trickster printers. And it was just the realization that, you know, as we modify human culture, as I've made the case, we deceive, we hide, we change stories. This means that our DNA is evolving potentially to modify human culture in a way that is advantageous to DNA. In other words, those people who lie the best, those people who hide the details of story the best, those will be the ones successful in human society. And so that is what I call the principle of mutational servitude, which is, with time, you would expect that the changes to human religion, human culture, human IDs are more and more serving DNA, in the same way the phenotype was. So in that way, the memes are phenotypic with respect to DNA. They exist in servitude to DNA. And this explains, for example, why religions have converged toward highly reproductive entities. I mean, you will make 0.5, 0.6 more babies if you're a Christian as opposed to if you're an atheist in the US. So that explains that kind of observation, why we don't see parasitic IDs the way the mimeticists were predicting.
So it's almost like, well, I guess this is where memes fail, and this is where, if we come back to what we said earlier, it's that not all queens are made equal, is that because of this principle of mutational servitude, like one is seated in the other, almost. And this kind of ties into, I think you used the example of the tango in your book, which is one person could be a great dancer while the other one is hopeless, and they sort of like, they're made to look like they're better than they are, but they're actually not the one doing the work. It's
exactly.
So it's like a dependency.
Memes would qualify as this. They shine. Human culture seems beautiful, but that doesn't mean it has its own evolutionary interest, and that doesn't mean it can evolve in a blazing way, challenging the evolutionary interest of DNA. In fact, it can't, and that's why most people's IDs are in line with reproduction. I mean, there are exceptions, but what people think about mostly is heat, sex, creativity, social status. Those are all things that relate to reproduction in either direct or indirect ways. So the reason human culture evolves that way is that it's a phenotypic expression of DNA.
Okay. So that's the 4 problems. I wonder if we should dig now into the principle of everlasting fingerprints, because I've got that here. Because that sort of then talks about that's basically proof for the existence of a printer replacement, right?
Yes, in a way. So essentially, the problem I was faced with is, why do we have genetic layers? So we've known for many decades now that we have DNA. It's the reproductive entity. It's the replicator. But DNA always passes through RNA to do something. And most RNA always passes through proteins to do something. So we have these 3 layers: DNA, RNA, proteins. why is it this way? Why do we have this? And how is it even possible for such a 3-layer system to evolve? Uh, and what does it tell us about the past? I found what it tells us about the past. It tells us that there has been 3 phenotypic revolutions in our history. Why do we know this? Well, we know this from the principle of everlasting fingerprint. And it goes as follows. Because the 3 problems can only be solved by a replicator tango, and because replicator tangos, they involve a combination of 2 genetic material that are mirroring each other, and because replicator tangos end up in the self-replication of whichever material is the superior one, you have life forms, they start with a single layer of genetic material. In our case, the molecules that preceded us were proteins. Proteins must have eventually engaged in a replicator tango with RNA. RNA became a replicator from this replicator tango, and boom, we had one phenotypic revolution. And then RNA eventually produced DNA, engaged in a replicator tango with DNA, and boom, we had another phenotypic revolution completed. And so we are DNA-based being. We are the product of a series of phenotypic revolutions that have preceded us. And each layers, ultimately, that's the principle of everlasting fingerprint. It's that because these problems can only be solved by something that is a replicator tango, therefore, each layer is the representation of an old, ancient phenotypic revolution. And it therefore happened, well, either 2 or 3 times in our history, and we can get into the details of why we can't even put our finger on whether it's 2 or 3. But yeah, it certainly happened from protein to RNA, and then from RNA to DNA.
Okay, cool. So if I was to sum this up, then the fingerprints are basically evidence of this process that we've discussed of the 4 problems, and of a tango existing to basically defeat problem 1, defeat problem 2, stalemate problem 3, open the door to then win problem 4, and therefore create a revolution. And the fingerprints are basically evidence to that effect.
Exactly.
That
Beautifully said.
That we believe that it's happened in the past. Yeah.
And the way you can see it is some kind of filter. There may have been millions of life forms attempting phenotypic revolution, but only those that did a replicator tango have survived up to now, have succeeded at doing it.
Could we extend that idea into maybe there have been life forms that have attempted a replicator tango, but were inferior as replicators and therefore failed on the 4th problem and maybe digressed? Or like, is that possible?
It's definitely possible. You can even push this to the extreme and say that in our relation with the pigs and the cows, in a way, we are imperfect trickster printers of them because we change them across generation in a way that trickster printers do, in a way. But we change only a couple of their genes. As I say in the book, we don't have high resolution over them. So they really keep evolving. But you could definitely see cows and pigs and even those GMO modified plants, for example, as we're kind of tempted by the phenotypic revolution, but because we touch just 1 gene or 2 and then we leave them alone, it doesn't finish in a phenotypic revolution. You can also think that it may have happened in the past that there was serious attempts at phenotypic revolution that failed, but here's why it must be very rare. It's that to trigger a replicator tango, and so before you advance on anything, you need to solve the first 3 problems. And the first 3 problems can only be solved by a replicator tango. Because you only engage in a replicator tango if the other molecule is superior to you. It's very rare that life forms will attain a replicator tango and then revert back, because the step that justifies the first step into the phenotypic revolution, which is the superiority of the other, eventually subsumes you and ends up in your death and your defeat. Because if it was superior, then why not delegate all of your job to it?
Okay. Well, I mean, maybe I could counter that with, maybe because superiority is a broad term. So maybe, superior in one dimension, but perhaps not superior in multiple dimensions. And as a result, it could kind of ebb and then flow, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. You could think that it may have been useful in the replicator tango, but due to other environmental circumstance, once getting into self-replication, it may not have been as practical. So you can think of life forms that don't succeed at making the jump, but we've never heard of these life forms. All we see are life forms that 3 times have gone through the process and finished it.
Capiche. Okay, so then let's go back to memes and or the idea of queens that are not, I guess, that are more phenotype than replicator. So memes being one of them. So memes apparently solve number 1, solve number 2, but they fail from 3 onwards. So can we talk a little bit about these? I guess why memes fail, but also I think probably the bigger one is why tremes, which is another form of queen, fail, because I think a lot of people really do believe in this idea of the machines are going to take over, etc., etc. So can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I talk in my book, in the last chapter, I describe the danger of machines, and it's not the usual danger that people think. People think, oh my God, there's going to be artificial intelligence. It's going to be more intelligent than us. Therefore, we're done. The problem is that intelligence in and of itself is not the problem here. You could have a super intelligent machine, but it would still be at the service of humans. The reason being, evolution has its own mechanism to protect itself against the invasion of replicating machines. So suppose you have an AI, it's super intelligent, it surpasses all of our intelligence. I mean, in a way, we've already reached that point. For example, robots will beat us in chess. At this point, I think Google is recognized as giving more accurate diagnosis than a doctor. So essentially, machines have already beaten us in subdomains, and they will beat us in all domains eventually. Here's the thing, though. The machines can be turned off. You suppose that 99% of humanity was to be fooled by an AI that tricks them into not reproducing. What would happen evolutionarily is that there would be 1% of humanity still left. They would make babies. These babies would inherit the doubtful features of their parents, this kind of resistance to the machine. And you would have a repopulation of the planet by a bunch of humans who are doubtful of machines. Because of this natural selection process still happening, artificial intelligence is not a danger to humanity. Now, it may have huge impacts. It may totally destroy the workplace. If a robot can be made for $20,000 and it can operate a McDonald's on its own for 70 years at extremely low electricity costs, we're done with low salary workers. But those changes are not phenotypic revolutions. My point is, AI may have social impacts, but ultimately it doesn't have the capacity to initiate a phenotypic revolution until we do something very precise. Until we let this AI decide of our genes, the way RNA has let DNA decide of its genes. So once we engage in a trickster-printer relationship where we are the full replicator, this is the only place where an AI can take over planet Earth and can modify us into lesser versions of ourselves. And that is the danger with what doctors currently are playing with. They're playing with genetic manipulation. most of them being in the phenotype, so they won't be carried into the next generation. But we already have one doctor in China who claims to have modified 2 babies for giving them resistance to HIV because their father had HIV. That was the thinking that he's presented. As we start modifying ourselves with CRISPR, we are inevitably putting the foot in a phenotypic revolution. And we can talk about why that's bad. It is absolutely destructive to everything we hold dear and everything that we are, because it erases the normal evolutionary process, which is the only reason why we are what we are. The only reason you're creative, you love life, you want a partner, you can fall in love. The only reason everything that humans care about, they care about, is because we evolve. We evolve to be that way. And if you start letting a machine play with your genes and reconfigure you for its own definition of optimality, you will lose all of it until you are nothing else than a screw for this thing. It will do with you what we do to culture right now. It will shape you, sculpt you, deceive you. It will transmit genes to your children that are not even from you, that are from it. And once we let ourselves be sculpted in that way, we become a machine for the machine. We become a tool in the same way that our feet, our arms, and our hearts and lungs are tools for us. Don't become a tool of those machines, and don't ever let humanity take this path, because there's no way back. And I can explain why there's no way back and why it's a self-reinforcing process. But once we start this and we get rewarded by it, and we can see the little children not having diseases and running into the field, the temptation will be too big to improve everything. And by wanting to improve everything, we will eventually
Lose
farm
everything.
ourselves into nothing. Yes.
Yeah. So I think to interject here, it's like the warning is, do not get into a tango with another replicator, because you'll it's a path to becoming obsolete, particularly if the replicator is more advanced.
Absolutely. Because we have now the scientific theory of phenotypic revolution, we know exactly what's the danger. The danger is that we know how replicator tangos end. They end with the native replicator, us, being farmed into nothing, into twos, and we would only survive. We wouldn't survive as humans, but our DNA, there are some pieces of our DNA that would be recycled by the machine eventually. Maybe some of our organs could be used as batteries or whatever to power it. But eventually that's the end. And, it may sound like an exaggeration, Matrix style, but it is not at all. The way DNA destroyed the RNA life form, you have no idea how vicious it was. I mean, we took pieces of it, we digested them, and we reshaped it in creative ways. And it's about to be done to us. It's about to be done to us, and we're about to do it to ourselves. And RNA,
I was about to say, yeah.
Yeah, RNA did it to itself, and it wasn't a problem. Once it had invoked into the world DNA, a superior molecule with better storage capacity, and once it had trusted DNA to produce its babies, all of the mathematics were locked in. The inevitable consequence was that RNA would finish up as some molecules that can be broken and patented, hacked together and plugged together, which is exactly what's happening in our body right now. If we let technology do this to us, technology will just rip us and plug us and say, oh, here's some genes for submissiveness. Oh, here's some genes for communism. Boom, let's plug this together and see what happens. We will turn into the evolutionary relationship is exactly the one that happens when an insect turns from a solitary lifestyle to a colony lifestyle. Sterile worker in colonies cannot reproduce. And The reason for it is there's a whole evolutionary history to it, but if I was to just summarize it, essentially one day one insect had handicapped babies. They were handicapped, they couldn't reproduce. And the handicapped babies, instead of just disappearing and failing evolutionarily, stayed around the queen, the birthing queen, the new queen, because there was no queen before. And eventually, the handicapped babies helped the queen so much that they became colonies, and it became their main mode of reproduction. And every queen that would leave its colony would know that at this new place where they would land, it would be in their interest to produce a lot of handicapped babies. Babies that at first were just, it was random. They were not meant to be sterile worker. It was an accident. Their genes were broken. But this accident was good for the queen, and the queen continued to produce these handicapped baby, which across millions of years became sterile worker. The relationship that we would have with machines, if we let them modify our genes, is the exact same that happens between the sterile worker and the queen. We won't be able to reproduce on our own. We would have to trust the machine. The machine will modify us into submissive beings. What does that mean for humanity? It means that we will be walking emotionless, like soldiers, self-sacrificial entities for saving these machines and copying them. Once it is the case that these machines have come into a city and have modified everyone's gene according to its own preference, it will turn us into soldiers of this thing. And being a sterile worker of an ant colony means being willing to self-sacrifice at any time for the queen, having no care for yourself, having no desire in life, having no curiosity to investigate the world, having no desire to find a beautiful sexual partner, having no originality, having none of the things that exist in humanity because we're trying to advertise ourselves. Because ultimately, why are people having Lamborghinis, and why do people become rich? Why do people become CEOs? Why do people go to the university? Why do people put makeup on? Why do we do everything we do? It's because we are incentivized to be the best versions of ourselves, because we carry genes in our balls and in our ovaries. If we didn't carry our genes, and if our genes were located in some hard drive at some Main Street clinic, there would be no incentives for us to be successful at anything. The only incentives would be to help the hard drive reproduce and turn more human puppets to its service in the universe. And eventually that thing would not only decide to make us tools of itself, it would destroy us because it wouldn't need us. So weigh it very carefully when you think about how the progresses of medicine and science could save us, could allow us to cure Parkinson's disease and cure Alzheimer's. I'm all for finding cures, but let's not destroy ourselves in the process. Let us never be tempted by genetic modification that will totally erase the evolutionary pressures that are necessary to maintain us into who we are.
Mm-hmm. So many threads I want to put on there. But before I do, could we? Because I guess I had before this part of the discussion. This is the part of the discussion that I had as the end of DNA, and talking about your story about naturals versus chosens, which you've effectively just done there. But before we dig a little bit further into that, can we talk a little bit about the origins of sex? Because I think that context will help understand this a little bit better. So you call it the phenotypic separation theory of sex. But can we talk a little bit about that? Because I think from what I understood in listening to the book was the fact that that two sexes exist, is weird because it's like a two-step process, which doesn't, evolutionarily traditionally make sense, but you've kind of made sense of it.
Yeah. So the chapter.
Talk us through and why that's important.
Yeah, so the chapter about the evolution of sex kind of stands totally outside of this book, because all of the rest of the book is about the phenotypic revolution and what happens when genes start playing with themselves. But then all of these ideas that I've been developing to solve my problem, they also solve the separate problem, and I just couldn't pass on the opportunity to talk about it. It's that this question of how meiosis evolved. And meiosis is this process by which we produce sperm and egg. So we see ourselves as being diploid organisms. So all of our cells, they contain two copies of the genome. If you look at a chromosome, the chromosome is kind of like an X or something, or some of them are more bent and everything, but it's always like two parts, and we inherit a part from our mother and a part from our father, and they contain almost the exact same information, just little differences that we call alleles, which create really the diversity within humanity. So our body is made up of this two-copy genome in each cell, and yet when we create a sperm or an egg, half of it disappears, and half of it disappears so that there can be recombination, so that we can contribute half of the genome of our children and our sexual partner contributes the other half. Now, in this process, you need to have a cell that decides to divide into, that decides, instead of recopying its entire genome, abandons 50% of it and gives 50% of its genome to the other side, which becomes the sperm or the egg. The other 50% is discarded, and which leaves place for the sperm or the egg to come and recombine. So this abandonment of gene is very bizarre. It's a process that, from the selfish gene perspective, is literally impossible or close to impossible. Why would genes abandon half of themselves? And wouldn't the genes that get abandoned eventually revolt? The answer is yes, they should. The theory of evolution predicts that the genes would eventually be offended. I'm terming it in human anthropomorphic terms here, but eventually the genes that get kicked out would find ways to not get kicked out, and they would find ways to kick out the other genes, and there would be wars within the organism as to who gets kicked out, and eventually none of the genes would accept to be kicked out. Eventually the evolutionary convergence would be toward total warfare as to who gets in the sperm and who gets in the egg. Now that can be resolved, this warfare situation, by saying, well, as long as you're in a sexual species and you get your 50% chance of passing to the next generation, you have no interest in warfare. And if there's many babies produced, it really doesn't matter that you're in all these babies, and engaging in warfare with the other genes anyways would ruin the organism. It would lead to the death of the organism, and then you would have zero chance. So there's a way you can stabilize this, but this thinking is only valid once the sexual life form is already established. So it works for the last billions of years when it was happening. As long as sex existed already, we can totally explain why there's no conflict within your cells to get into the gamete. But we certainly cannot explain the very first event, not without my book. So we were like, how do you get the first abandonment? Now you have to imagine a life form that resembles some kind of bacteria or single cell eukaryote, as we call them. And this cell would divide in two, would have two copies of its genome already, would divide in two. But why would it divide in two? there's no other egg there. There's no other sperm out there. It would be the first cell to ever divide in two that way, to produce protogametes. There's no way a sperm can be functional without an egg, and there's no way an egg can be functional without a sperm. So we find ourselves with the first step of meiosis, the first time it happened. We can't explain why it would happen. Well, I found the explanation. So we talked about how, for example, branches of trees can be detached from the tree and still survive. And in that way, it's a part of the phenotype that is detached and becomes a genotype. It becomes the new being that will eventually make babies, the little piece of branch that grows into a tree. As it turns out, if you invoke that kind of situation, you can solve the problem of sex, and it goes that way. So it mixes some of the thinking around these branches of trees being detached and some of my thinking around sterile workers and ant colonies. So what if the first cell that divided into two gametes, the gametes were, their purpose was not reproduction. They were just staying around, just like the handicapped babies of the queen ant. They were staying around, and they were just helping the queen cell, somehow making these dysfunctional babies, these babies that couldn't possibly reproduce because they just have half of the genome. Somehow that was still good for the queen. So like sterile workers, they stayed around and they became specialized more and more at helping the queen cell. Eventually, the queen cell finds itself with a problem. It's that its sterile workers are not reproductive. And so she can make maybe 5, 10, create a little shell around her, but it's not enough. She would like to have 1,000, 2,000, or millions like we do in our body. So the queen cell may have found the evolutionary solution as follows. Since these handicapped babies are unable to reproduce, what if we combine them together? What if I take these two handicapped babies and mix them together? Suddenly they are a full genome creature. Suddenly they were able to make copies of themselves. And in that theory, the first event that led to a meiosis, to the creation of a sperm and an egg, was not for reproduction. It was for phenotypic copying. It was the creation of a copying entity around a cell that just needed protection. And the reason the Adam and Eve, the two first sperm and egg, ever collided was to actually help its queen cell. It was to serve better as sterile workers, because making copies of itself, this sterile cast of cells was suddenly able to serve 10-fold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold the services that they owed to the queen to make her more performant, to make her more optimal. Now, so for many millions of years, potentially, this would have been the system. One cell creates some defective cell around her. The defective cells somehow protect her. And eventually, the defective cells start combining so that they can make defective babies themselves. Eventually, you would have had a detachment happening, the same way you can remove a branch from a tree and plant it elsewhere. Some of these cells that had gained reproduction, but they had gained reproduction just for the purpose of serving the queen cell. Eventually, they accidentally detach, and now they become their own life form. Not only their own life form, but the life forms capable of meiosis, capable of exchanging information through sexual reproduction. Once you invoke this theory, which I call a phenotypic separation, you solve how sex could happen, because the problem of losing half of your gene doesn't exist in this situation, because these cells were already defective. They were not losing genes. They were not even aiming to reproduce. They were just aiming to make copies to serve the queen better. Now, thinking back about our problems, our 4 problems, what is the difference between this and a phenotypic revolution? The difference is that in the phenotypic revolution, we have invoked solutions to each of the problems. In the scenario I present for sex, we really just solve the first problem, and then we go away. And as it turns out, if you go away, and if you're capable of going away, that means the naked wire problem is not a problem for you. And if you go away, the trickster printer problem is not a problem for you, because there's no one annoying you with mutational modifications that you don't want. So if a life form just solves the first problem and then finds a way to just run away from its queen, it can survive. And I think it survived into essentially the ensemble of sexual beings on planet Earth, including mushrooms, plants, insects, all animals, all of us. We would be the descendant of an accidental separation from a line of descent that we were serving before.
That's really interesting. So in that case, that would have chronologically speaking come after the phenotypic revolution of DNA over RNA in the first place, right?
Yes, because the organism that first had sex was a DNA-based being. I would have to check when it happened. When did meiosis evolve? I always forget. It's at least 1 billion years ago, 1.2 billion years ago, over 1.2 billion years ago. So by then, DNA already was the dominant replicator. It has been since 4 billion years.
Okay. Interesting. So how does this tie now into the end of DNA thesis, which is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is, by us engaging in a replicator tango with another replicator and potentially, making ourselves servile to a better replicator, do we end up in a situation where our own, I guess, meiosis is thrown out the window? Is it almost like a reversal of, the sex disappears, right? Like in this thing.
We can talk about it because there's many possibilities, but how it ties is very simple. We have to understand who we are. We are the product of the third phenotypic revolution of planet Earth. We are DNA-based being. We are what we are because DNA evolves. And we are what we are potentially, if my theory of sex is true. It's an hypothesis for now. I think it's solid. It's as solid as anything I've seen before. But if it's true, then we are also the product of a phenotypic separation that led us into this extremely dynamic evolution that sex is, because by engaging in sex, we are shuffling our genes all the time, and we're evolving orders of magnitude faster. This is why everything that you see with the naked eye, mammoth and big tigers and beautiful birds, all of it is really a product of sexual selection. The non-sexual life forms, they stay small, at least as far as we can see up to now. And they stay very simple, really. So we are this. We are sexual being emerging from potentially a phenotypic separation and from 3 phenotypic revolution. If we engage in a phenotypic revolution now, we will undermine certainly our status as DNA-based being and possibly our status as sexual being. And here's how it goes. Well, we talked about parthenogenesis, right? Well, here's the thing. Once a central entity like a clinic starts taking in couples to modify their genes, oh, you got this disorder, let's fix it. Let's remove it from your children. Oh, here we found this gene that would lead to your children having Parkinson's disease. Let's remove it. Oh, here we found a gene that makes your child aggressive. Let's remove it. So that's the kind of modification we will start engaging in, and eventually potentially it gets into the oh well, how about we change intelligence, and how about we change talents of all kind, and how about we change emotional submissiveness and that kind of stuff. Once we start playing with all this, we are potentially creating databases of all of the genes that deserve to be changed. And as a consequence, we also have databases of who you would want to reproduce with. And if you want, you can have a virtual mate. Why would we care about genetically scanning a man and combining the genes of an actual man with yours? All we can do is we're going to take one of your egg if you're a female, and we're going to give you a synthetic genome for the sperm part that we have a catalog. What do you want? Brown hair, blonde hair, blue eye, whatever. So we will have people starting to reproduce with virtual beings and beings that don't exist really. Catalog made sets of genetic recommendation. And no matter if they do have a partner in life or not, it will end up that the machine will eventually have so much control over what genes are being selected that you can as well say that they're not your children, that they are the children of the machine. And so no matter if there will be actual males used in future reproduction, certainly those males will be subject to tweaking. There will be doctors telling you, here's a list of 150 genes that we can change and that will make your children's life better. So that's how we end in the end of DNA. Is that we're about to put an end to the replication of DNA and replace it with virtual tweaking by machines and by doctors and by algorithms.
So I love the hubris of it all, because it's it's always in one of my favorite sayings in life is the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and this is exactly one of those examples of fools thinking that there's a pathway forward here. But I guess my rebuttal to this is, I guess, the complexity around genetic adjustments and things like that. For me, I guess, whenever I look at any holistic system, be it the holistic system of an economy, or the holistic system of the anthroposphere, or nature, or the environment, or human beings ourselves, probably one of the more complex systems out there. I would guess that there's actually, by messing around with a few genes, there's a possibility that we actually do more damage in the process of, let's say we change one thing here, thinking that we're maybe lowering, let's say, aggression. But in lowering aggression, the subsequent order effects that has is that person is no longer as driven. So, you try and fix one thing, but you end up creating another problem. So, I would rebut the progress of that path as something that will probably impede itself, because we are incapable of understanding the subsequent order effects of fucking with something here and what it's going to cause later. So what do you think about that?
Well, those are worries, but I'm super worried about focusing on this, because in the long term, in the grand scheme of things, it's not so important. Because here's what's going to happen. You're going to have these worries. Of course, there are worries. Just the first genetic modification that was done in China, if it's been done for real. So Dr. He tells us, I modified these two daughters, because their father has HIV, and so I gave them a gene that protects them from HIV infections. CCR5, they call. It's just an attachment to cells that we have found out of random exist in the European population and doesn't exist commonly in the Asian population. And as it turns out, it protects about 13% of the world population to HIV. It's not that they cannot possibly have HIV, but it's that they have much less chance of getting it. So genetic addition, what's wrong with it? I mean, don't you want these two little girls to be HIV free? Well, yeah, I want this. But long term, suppose we do this a lot. Suppose that it leads to changes of behavior. Well, first, there are the accidental changes of behavior. We eventually found that CCR5 is also involved in cognition and may improve your cognition. Oops. So accidentally, you now have better cognition. You have better memory or whatever. Well, that may increase your value on the sexual market. So there you have two ladies unleashed into the world with no incentive to wear condoms, super desirability on the sexual market because they have increased cognition. They essentially have it all. They can even have sex with anyone they want, and they won't ever get HIV on top of it. What can this lead to? Well, I can easily think that if we were to do this 1 billion times, that we would find major changes of mores and ways of behaving in society. We may actually have killed monogamy forever. If everything becomes so easy, we will give up some of our humanity and some of what makes us a monogamous, well, at least attempting to be monogamous species. So there are these unplanned and accidental consequences that we should think about. But I'm extremely careful about not dragging the attention of people to these things, because here's the problem. You're going to have these issues. Eventually, the doctors will tell you, well, science is now advanced and we have found that there is absolutely no risk. So what are you going to do then when they can say, well, we have control for all these risks. There will be no accidental consequences. Just like they're doing with anything these days, with vaccines, with all sorts of things that they push onto people. In the end, the ultimate argument is, even if you were to ensure me that there is no danger of any outside consequence, the consequence of the phenotypic revolution is grave enough in and of itself to justify us depriving ourselves of any of these temporary gains. Okay, some girls are not going to have HIV, but you're going to destroy humanity long run. You're going to destroy all of the evolutionary pressures that led us into great beings. You don't want to do this. So that's why it's a red herring to some extent, all of these little ethical problems. And you have a dozen professors being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars right now in departments of bioethics, just thinking about these small problems and not giving a crap about the greater consequence.
The elephant
it's
in the
unbelievable.
room. Yeah. So I fundamentally agree with that. I guess my point, maybe I didn't articulate it well, is that the presupposition here for the phenotypic revolution is that this process of replication is superior to the existing sexual process of replication that exists today. And my argument there was, maybe it's actually not. Maybe we think it is, but in the process of thinking, like these deranged maniacs who, attempt to go down this path of, genetic adjustments and mutation and additions or whatever they're doing, in the process of them doing that and thinking that they're making it better, they end up with a cobra effect. Like they solve one problem, but they create 5 more. And I know these are the more minutiae problems, but in that process, actually turn that replicator into an inferior replicator, because the kind of people that come out on the other end might seem better across some dimensions, but the trade-offs are actually worse than what they thought they might have been. So as a result, it fails the 4th problem, which is, yes, forgetfulness is solved, naked warrior problem is solved, but it might even get into the tango, but it fails the replacement problem because it's not good enough, because it just can't compete with the superior sexual replication process. You know what I mean?
Well, that is a very positive view, but it's not going to happen. Here's why. Superior, you are treating it in a subjective way. I agree with your subjective evaluation of what's superior, but by the standard of the theory of evolution, what is superior is what spreads faster in terms of replication. So here's a thought experiment to show you how you cannot win against this machine. Suppose you have a good gene inside of you, and scientists identify it, and they say, "Wow, Alex, you're the only one who has this gene in the entire planet, and it gives you superb advantage. You're going to make more babies. You're going to be more healthy, etc." How long would it take for this genetic innovation inside of you to spread across the whole of humanity? How long would it take before everyone in Asia have your gene? Well, you would have one sexual partner, you would make a couple babies. Maybe these babies would be successful, and maybe your genes would spread into the country that you're in right now. And maybe eventually it would get into Canada, and maybe eventually it would get into Europe, but it would be a long process. The answer is it would take millions of years for sure for this genetic mutation to get into all humans. Compare this with the machine. The machine has the internet. It knows that you have this gene. It knows that it's better. It introduces into its recommendation, and in one generation, the entirety of humanity benefits from this gain. That's the competition you're up against. Your sexual reproduction at 3 babies per couple, which is even a high because it's not even the average. Most people make 2 babies per couple and less. So you're not going to compete with a machine that can upload your advantage into every one of the next generation within one generation. Impossible.
Okay. I see what you mean. It's so velocity there is important. I guess. Yeah. I guess, yeah. So this actually reminds me. Have you ever read Nick Bostrom's book, Superintelligence?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, it's a good one. I mean, he puts forward a bunch of ideas about how superintelligence may emerge and basically obsolete us and blah blah blah. Anyway, I don't agree with everything he says in there, but one dimension he talks about in there is the capacity for a potential superintelligence to compress time and run, multiple programs or do more in less time, and as a result, be able to, replicate is not the word he used, but basically advance itself much faster, which I guess in some sense, that's what this machine represents, is the capacity to do what would take natural selection a long time to do that in potentially a short time, even though mistakes might happen along the way, and some of these attempts to do something better will likely devolve, but it doesn't take, of every 100 that fuck up, all it takes is 1 to succeed in order to progress. But that process can happen faster. I don't know. I still feel like it's messy, but I see where you're coming from, because yeah, I've always thought that
it's not messy. It's rooted in a principle that is the natural selection. So here's the kind of machine we have to be scared about, and those we don't. If a machine is just intelligent, it can just output highly complex stuff and make highly complex calculation. But if it's not motivated to destroy us, if it's not motivated to even survive itself, it's not a dangerous machine. We can turn it off and it's going to be okay. What we have to be careful with are machines that are evolutionary, that they replicate and therefore they get better and they get more and more selfish with time. They replicate, or they play with human genetics and indirectly therefore replicate. So those are the 2 machines. We have to monitor the first, that the first that just replicate without playing with human genetics. They are dangerous because they can do a phenotypic separation and eventually outcompete us ecologically. The second type is dangerous. Those that play with human genetics are dangerous because we have to monitor them for a phenotypic revolution, in which case they will farm us into nothingness.
Okay, that's perfectly put. So, moral of the story: don't get into a replicator tango. Moral
Exactly.
of the story
Everything,
is
everything that
don't
tried
try
it
and play God.
before, they lost, and we will lose too. It's not
Yeah.
something where you can try a little bit and see what happens. Here's how it happens. You get interested into more and more genetic modification because it actually helps you more and more. It does fix your disorder. It does make you make more beautiful. It does make your babies make more babies. And so the more this machine essentially enters humanity by rewarding it infinitely until it destroys it. And this is the way to hell paved with good intentions. This is exactly it. Up to the very end, this machine keeps making you better. It's just that the better that it's making you is different across times. Eventually, better means, oh, you mean you need to be more submissive. Oh, you need to not contest the authority of the rest of the city because we all live from the same hard drive here. We must not be in conflict with each other, and so it lowers your aggressivity, and then the creativity disappears out of just secondary consequences of these things. So the better that it makes you into is better for it. It's not better for you.
Okay, I want to ask 3 more questions because I think that's I think people need to not just when they're listening to this is I don't think the intention here is to freak people out, but it's to make them fucking think that I guess we've both echoed it here, is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Is like this idea of trying to play God doesn't end well. And it's just because something is good now doesn't mean that the step-by-step doesn't mean that because each individual step is compatible with the selfish gene hypothesis, that the path, the direction that you're headed in is compatible, which I think is one of the hypotheses, or one of the positions you take in the book, is that the phenotypic revolution, on a contextually speaking, on a grand scale, is contrary to the selfish gene idea, but each step along the way is not. So therefore, it doesn't violate that principle of natural selection. So it's
Exactly.
yeah. So I think I'd like to ask you on a different track. Is which question should I ask? I'm interested in this. Let's go the abiogenesis. This is a completely different. It's a different tangent, but it's obviously related. But abiogenesis versus sort of proteins and quantum evolution, or quantum Darwinism. I don't know the exact term there, but I'd love to dig into that a little bit, because that was something I found interesting, and I'd love to hear some more thoughts from you on that. Versus this idea of sort of phenotypic turtles all the way down, right? I'd love to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So when you go deep into the phenotypic revolution, you realize that it may not have the end that you think it has, because I was in front of this theory which clearly lays out, all right, all of the genetic layers will be the reflection of an ancient phenotypic revolution. So I think from DNA to RNA to proteins. But then you can ask yourself, are proteins really the bottom layer of living existence? And it's a tough problem because we don't have full answers to it. And so I couldn't take a strong position in the book. But I did point out that in quantum physics, there is a thing called quantum Darwinism. And it is believed that processes of processes of natural selection really may happen in the background of the universe, may explain part of the properties of quantum physics. It is not a theory for which there is absolute certainty, but it is a theory that is mathematically elegant and seems to actually address much of the mystery with why the axioms of quantum physics are the way they are. So it's a theory that seems to fit with what we see. The theory would go as follows. Quantum states, the states of quantum fields, because they can take different forms, they can take different values. And yet in quantum theory, they adopt these values on kind of a probabilistic manner, in the same way the Schrodinger cat. We don't know if it's dead or if it's not dead. But in classical mechanics, they take stable values. And it does seem that, you know, when I see a table in front of me, I don't see the table disappearing randomly and then reappearing. It's always there or it's not there. So this transition from the quantum probabilistic world to the classical world has been explained by a professor of physics from the perspective of the theory of evolution. Essentially, the quantum physics state would be subject to an selection process where some states would be interacted with by the environment, which would essentially force the probability to occupy some position, to be of one value. And this would be forced by a process very much analogous between how it does it to life forms. So in the same way life forms evolve to be more and more resistant to their environment, quantum states would evolve to be more and more resistant to their environment. Now, there are mysteries left in there, and we need to address, is that actually evolution happening at the quantum level, or is that just an analogy? And we don't have the answer to this. But I said in my book, if it's true that quantum Darwinism is an actual representation of what's happening down there, and it does explain, and that's how physics work, then we have another replicator. Then DNA is not the first replicator. RNA is not the first replicator. Proteins is not the first replicator. But the quantum Darwinian replicator is the first one. So it's a tentative hypothesis, but a very pleasant one, because it literally means that everything is alive in the universe, and that the question is not so much how does life come from non-life, but the question is, at which degree of life are you? Are you just life in the sense that you're made of quantum fields? Or are you life in the sense that you're made of RNA replicating stuff? Or are you life in the sense that you are a DNA-based being? If quantum Darwinism is true, that's as deep as the revolutionary phenotype goes. It's by saying the proteins are not even our bottom genetic layer. Quantum physics is our bottom genetic layer. That would be a fascinating outcome, but I cannot say that I'm sure that it is the case. However, I do point out in my book, there is something very compelling into this view of the world, which is that what I found essentially means that the upper layers of the genetic code are always good at controlling the lower ones. So DNA, what does it do? Well, it only produces RNA and copies of itself. RNA, what does it do? Well, it only produces proteins and copies of itself. And then you ask yourself, what is the bottom layer of the genetic code doing? What are proteins doing? Well, as it turns out, we consider proteins to be enzymes. They essentially manipulate the probability of physical event happening or not happening. That's how they build our entire body. That's how they operate the complex chemistry of the human body. And when you think about it, all they do is manipulate quantum states. We know that, for example, when a light ray arrives and hits the protein in a plant, allowing it to create energy through solar, to recuperation of part of the solar energy, we know that it's very much a quantum effect. It's a photon hitting a particularly configured protein. And so as much as we say that DNA controls RNA, that RNA controls protein, we could say that protein controls the quantum replicator, if quantum Darwinism is true. And then we have a fascinating case of turtles all the way down, essentially phenotypic revolutions all the way down.
Very, 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 very interesting. So that leads me really nicely into my next question. So I don't know which one I should ask you, but it's, you know, is it, you know, are proteins created in the image of God? You know, so and I guess that the real question behind that is like, where does the idea of God or the divine fit in? You know, in I guess where the theme of humans are created in the image of the divine. Like if we're turtled all the way down, you know, is it that, you know, there's some quantum states were the image of God, or, you know, or if that is not the case, are proteins actually created in the image of God? I'd love to hear your thoughts around God and the divine within this context.
Well, I'm personally an atheist or an agnostic, depending on how you want to define it. So I don't believe in a personal God, but it depends.
Mm-hmm.
If you believe in a personal God, there is no place for it in the phenotypic revolution. The Revolutionary Phenotype is just a scientific book that describes how life emerges. And you can think that it's God playing a puppet master behind the scene, but it's not going to be proved nor commented on by my theory. If you want to see, if you're more of these spiritual types who see God as this omnipresent force in the universe, including all of physics, then you can say, well, that this includes the processes by which genetic layers are made, the processes by which life forms across this universe have now, thanks to my theory, we know that they have a way to build better genetic codes. And so it really, what my theory does is that life is much more probable everywhere in the universe. Because one of the big problems was, oh, well, you need to have a replicator pop into existence. And it needs to be the case that this replicator is good to build upon complexity. My theory says the second condition doesn't even need to be met. All you need is a little replicator. And if the replicator is imperfect, it will eventually evolve to create more perfect replicators. That's the beautiful thing with this theory. Now, as far as meaning and God, well, here's one thing that the Revolutionary Phenotype does. It reveals that there are acts of creation in biology, which is something that has been denied by biologists for a long time, and that creationists, people who believed in the Bible, were saying we were created by God. Well, my book is kind of a middle ground between the two. It tells us life forms do acts of creation. These acts of creations are phenotypic revolution. It's different from a creation by God, but it's definitely an act of creation, an act of production of something else from within the phenotype. And in that sense, the creationists were right about creation being involved. They were just wrong about the creator. The creator is not God. The creator is always a previous life form.
Okay, I love that. So then the last piece I wanted to dig into here is we touched on this before we started, was the people like, so David Belinsky, David Jalarendra, and Stephen Meyer. You know, there's sort of been some discussions about, you know, mathematical challenges to Darwin's theory of evolution. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on, I guess the crux of what they're saying is that the whole Darwinist, the Darwinist reality can't be possible because it's mathematically impossible for, you know, that sort of complexity to emerge by accident or through some blind process. So I guess what they're angling at is that there's some sort of, and I don't know if this is what they're angling at, but it's like some sort of divine creation. But I mean, you said you've looked into that a little bit. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, the argument that evolution is not true because it's mathematically improbable or impossible is not valid. These people are taking all of the blocks of a protein, and the building blocks of a protein are amino acids, and they're counting the mathematical possibilities as if life was a throw of the die. And, you know, life is not a throw of the die. It's a different algorithm. If you were to throw die and try to rebuild, for example, the ribosome with its thousands, tens of thousands of amino acid, yes, it would take trillions and trillions of die throwing, and you wouldn't get there. But that's not what evolution does. Evolution is a search and establish that it works, and then search again and establish that it works, and then search again and establish that it works. It's not playing casino. Life forms are not playing casino. They are doing exactly the opposite. They are a search algorithm that tries something and it kind of works, and then they try to build upon it, and then they try to build upon it. So these mathematicians who come and they say, oh, it would take 100 trillion time to generate the ribosome. Okay, but what if you had intermediate steps? What if there was a smaller ribosome that was kind of doing the job? And what if you were to build upon it? You know, ultimately the ribosome actually operates on a functional molecule that is a tRNA inside of the ribosome. And the number of letters in this tRNA molecule is very low. Length of a tRNA, I just want to give you the exact number, 76 to 90 nucleotides. So we start with a ribosomes, which is a complex molecule, and you're like, oh my God, it's a building. It has 80,000 or whatever amount of amino acids. That seems like a complex molecule. Oh yeah, but the heart of it, the thing that operates inside of it, that really does the work, is a 76 letter long molecule. Now suddenly the probabilities look much more close to where random could get there. I can throw die enough times to get to a 76 combination in my life. And when you consider that life didn't have just 70 years to do it, but it had 4 billion years to do it, certainly it is possible for life to attain these small solutions and then build upon it. It's exactly what natural selection does. It creates these temporary stages of quasi-functionality. And really, what evolution cares about is not that things are optimal. Evolution has plenty of time to make them optimal in the long run. What really matters is that things work for a while. The condition for evolving is to satisfy reproduction, not to optimize reproduction.
That's a very, 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 very good analogy, because I think I intuitively, was, I guess, perturbed by the way they were trying to completely dryly mathematically frame the probability around just throwing dice. So I think you perfectly nailed that one. So I just don't think that it's just the straight mathematical equation. Is that there's almost, I guess that does away with even the concept of the selfish gene. Like you said, it's, life is attempting to do something. So there's almost, I get at the risk of anthropomorphizing it here, is like there's an intent there. And whereas what they're assuming is that there's absolutely zero intent, that it's completely blind, and that, like you said, throwing at a casino, throwing dice at a casino.
To frame it without the intent, it's quite simple. It's that these people are assuming that life is a probabilistic random algorithm, when in fact life is a search and find and build algorithm. It's still an algorithm, but it's much more complex than a crapshoot at random.
Okay. Last quick question, as you're describing, then we'll sort of wrap this up, is where does, I did a podcast a little while ago with some Bitcoiners. So I did one podcast called Bitcoin Atheists, and then the next episode was Bitcoin Preachers. So I sort of brought people who, they get this whole Bitcoin thing, they get libertarianism, they get economics and all this, but they come at it from different angles. two of the guys were atheists, two of the guys were preachers. And one question that I just felt nobody could really answer very well, and it is a hard one, is this notion of, let's call it consciousness. And I guess consciousness, you can look at it in the anthropomorphic layer of human beings and sort of intent, I guess. But then as you sort of go into the micro, is almost this the selfishness, like the survival, or the algorithm that you just mentioned, which is a create and build algorithm, has echoes of the idea of consciousness embedded in it, I guess, if I'm looking at it from that angle. So what's your thoughts on the idea of consciousness?
Well, that takes me back to my first interest, because before realizing stuff in the domain of evolutionary biology, I was a neuroscientist working on the brain. Mm-hmm. I've worked with lampreys, monkeys, and I worked with human subjects also on psychiatry and psychological stuff, cognition and stuff. So what is consciousness? Well, consciousness is a self-referential loop into a virtually created space of experience. And it's hard to wrap your head around how can you get this. But the ultimate answer is, as it turns out, the universe is such that you can plug wires into each other in a way that construct these experiences. Just like you can plug wires in a particular configuration that will lead to a Windows desktop being displayed on your computer. Now, the electrons that are circulating in your CPU, they're not really a 2D space, really like the Windows desktop, but they create this illusion of a 2D space. And it turns out that our brain can create the illusion of a 3D space. Now, this illusion turns out not to be an illusion. It turns out to be an actual representation of an actual 3D space. But that's how I would see it. I would say that the brain creates a virtual space inside of us, and it seeks to map this virtual space to the best of its ability to the actual space outside of us. Now, why do we do this? Probably because it was better to have it that way than to have it another way. Because we are decision makers, essentially our brains exist because having the ability to make decisions at every point in time was better for our reproduction than not having these abilities. And it started from the smallest animals being capable of feeling a touch and, oh, I'm going to swim away. That was the first decision ever made. Well, not the first. There were physiological processes in sponges, I guess, that could qualify as decisions. Oh, the light turns on. Let's activate these processes. And, oh, it's dark now. It's at night. Let's activate these other processes. As the relationship between the organism and its environment becomes more and more complex, there's more and more things in the universe that you want to reproduce accurately. You may want, if your organism is highly visual, like we are humans, you'll want a space represented in the brain such that even if I close my eyes, I still know that this table is there and that this TV is there, and I could still stand and go get some snacks, even with my eyes closed. That's because the brain of humans has evolved to create a virtual construct of everything that's around us. And part of it is reliable, part of it is unreliable, as we see in cases of visual illusions, optical illusions, and other forms of illusions and self-deception. We don't quite represent the world in exactly the way it is. We have our brain that pays attention more to borders, to lengths, to forms, to colors, certain color more than others. All of these biases are probably traces of the evolutionary pressures that constructed this virtual space inside of us. And ultimately, why do we have it instead of not having it? It's probably because it was better to make decisions quicker and better. and that by having this representation of the space, we were more fit to act even in the absence of direct visual input. For example, when it was dark, we could still walk into a room. When we had our eyes closed, we could still know where things were. And in fact, without having your eyes closed, sometimes you just want to know where the objects are in your environment so you can grab them without looking at them. So all of these are advantages offered by having a virtual cognitive space instead of none.
Okay, so that's a great description, but it's in my mind it's a more anthropomorphic description. So consciousness in relationship to human beings. Do you think there's echoes of the? I guess maybe the color of consciousness that I'm talking about is almost. I know intent is the wrong word, but it feels like the right word here is just sort of this idea of, instead of random blind luck, or random processes happening, like sort of this intent of seeking or searching, and that driver, and again, you know, the echoes of that I kind of feel are consistent with things like the selfish gene. Is like the trickster printer is, one could argue, conscious because it is trying to survive. So maybe like consciousness is some sort of survival mechanism at the micro level. Like, am I on the right path here, or am I talking shit?
Well, I think you are on the wrong path. Essentially, you're looking for meaning in everything you see, and that's a noble thing. It's your curiosity driving you toward this. But consciousness is this special phenomenon of experience, of the world feeling like something rather than nothing. And so it's an internal virtual loop, and we may have our own, and perhaps animals, perhaps cats have consciousness, but it may feel slightly different than ours. But in any case, there is a fascination to be had in front of the complexity of the world, but it doesn't have to be labeled consciousness, nor does it have to be labeled meaning, because meaning is imperfect in these scenarios, because meaning really means something about a message. But there is no message in the universe. The universe is just the way it is, out of its its mathematical structure, and the fact that it obeys some laws. And that's how, to me, that's the greatest how you can experience. It's when you realize that this whole complexity and beauty all emerges from non-intended, non-conscious, and non-intentional and non-meaningful things. The fact that meaning can emerge from non-meaning is the best news you can ever hear in your life. The fact that you don't need meaning to start with, you don't need God to start with, and that just crap released in a 3D space will eventually converge into the beautiful beings that we are, and our conscious experience and everything we do, and the complexity of our lives and civilization. The fact that it comes from crap being shaken into a barrel should reassure you, because it means that you don't even need meaning and beauty and consciousness to start with to eventually get some of it. And that's the great beauty of life.
I would tend to agree, and I think that's a beautiful way to wrap this up. Seeing as though we went for a hell of a lot longer than I thought we would. I know you've got to run very shortly, so Jean, I would love to do an episode 2 down the track, where we sort of dig into a couple of things. Maybe as you're more progressed on your current book, the book about morality, because I've personally got some thoughts about that stuff. I actually take the view of yours, which is, I guess if I had to label myself as something similar to what you said, is, maybe I sit more in the atheist agnostic camp, but I believe that the emergent nature of existence gives us the beauty, the meaning, the principles and all of that sort of stuff. So it doesn't have to come from somewhere. I think that they're things that emerge because life seems to want to proceed, and I guess that for me is the guiding principle. And I've got some ideas on that. And, perhaps we can share some notes, but I would love to do a discussion down the track to see where we align in those thoughts.
I'm open to it. I enjoyed it. And you are one of the rare interviewers about my book who actually understood every aspect of it. And I could see it in your question. It's great to have worked so hard on a theory that finally I see some other human beings other than my audience who I know have read it for real. But sometimes I find myself with these interviewers who clearly do not understand. You understood every piece of it.
Thank you. I think that like we sort of said offline, is that we're drowning in a world of idiots and of fakes, and basically of like human beings that have practically become servile phenotypes themselves. And it's like it's really disappointing. So it's always encouraging to have these conversations and actually coming across work that is like this. I really enjoyed it. Like so likewise, thank you, and I appreciate the compliment. Before we wrap this up, where can people find you? On Twitter, on YouTube, can you just mention those things?
So yes, you can find me at jfg.world. You will see all of my social media link. And I host a show called JFG Tonight, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So I'm about to prepare to go host that show. We talk about science, philosophy, news, politics, all sorts of things.
Fantastic. All right, my friend. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate this. It was incredible conversation, and we will do a part 2.
All right. Bye-bye.